The Nvidia GeForce RTX 5090, flagship product of the new Blackwell range. This one's going to be interesting, controversial even. But in the new world of semiconductors where the latest process technology gets ever more expensive, Nvidia took the decision to use the same core fabrication technology as the outgoing 40 series. So, RTX 4090, already a very large, expensive chip to produce and relatively power-hungry. RTX 5090, it's an even bigger processor on the same base technology, a gigantic 744 square millimeters, consuming even more power than the 4090, up to 575 watts. There's the sense that Nvidia has pushed the new flagship product as far as it can go in all dimensions, but ultimately, in terms of performance, we're generally looking at a 22 to 38% increase in my tests, about 31% faster overall on average. As generational leaps go, this is as good as it's going to get with the new Blackwell architecture. 5080 down, expect lower gen-on-gen gains. So instead, Nvidia is looking to bring more awareness to other parts of the GeForce package. That starts with the Founders Edition card. The 5090 is a simply astonishing example of industrial design, bearing in mind the gigantic processor with its immense hardware requirements. I won't go into extreme depth on the makeup of the design. Gamers Nexus has done an excellent breakdown already. But all I can really say is that it's astonishing. The same level of high-quality design and execution as 40 series, but smaller, much smaller. Bearing in mind that 575 watts can flow through this design, it's remarkable how Nvidia has managed to cram all of this into a quiet two-slot chassis. So small, it will even fit within a small form factor PC. The other key technology Nvidia is talking about is DLSS 4 frame generation, and here's where things are definitely going to get controversial. We're reaching the point where producing cost-efficient GPUs based on scaling logic, scaling cuticles, it's getting harder and harder, more expensive. Improved process technologies do exist, but cost per transistor is not getting much better gen on gen. We've already seen with PS5 Pro that Sony is embracing ray tracing and machine learning. They think that further gains from basic rasterization won't be cost efficient for a console. So by extension, those constraints and challenges are influencing PC hardware as well. Sony is looking to machine learning to power the next frontier of gaming. And as everyone knows, that is essentially Nvidia's playbook. A wealth of forward-looking machine learning technologies were unveiled at CES 2025, but 50 series is being promoted on the strengths of DLSS 4 multi-frame generation. We'll go into more depth on this later, but check out this Cyberpunk 2077 demonstration I put together. Full path tracing, full RT overdrive on 5090 here, comparing the new DLSS transformer model super resolution with the various forms of frame generation with DLSS 4. With our new benchmarking tools, we can plot frame rate, frame time, and latency in real time over content. We'll have more tests later on, but ultimately, we're scaling from a 94.5 FPS average with super resolution to 286 frames per second with 4x multi-frame gen, a 302% frame rate multiplier with a latency cost of 9.39 milliseconds. Without any DLSS at all, the average is actually 35 frames per second with a 57.3 millisecond latency average. In this scenario, there's an 8x frame rate boost between native resolution rendering and the combination of super resolution and 4x multi-frame gen. And there's actually a latency reduction in this scenario of 20.5 milliseconds. Now, I would call this a frame rate boost from DLSS 4, but not strictly speaking a performance boost. But Nvidia begs to differ. But let's be clear here. We are looking at a rebalancing of the tasks the GPU will perform in games between software and hardware. With the hardware side becoming ever more expensive to make, expect everyone from Nvidia to AMD to Intel to Sony to Microsoft to be embracing software for quote-unquote performance boosts. Nvidia is at the forefront, but everyone is likely to follow suit. The discussion and discourse on this is going to be fascinating, but even without frame generation or DLSS at all, the RTX 5090 is by far and away the fastest GPU money can buy, as you would expect for 2,000 of your US bucks. Here's how the specs compare between 5090 and 4090. 33% increase in CUDA-core count, while a gigantic 512-bit memory interface provides a 77% boost to memory bandwidth. Plus we're moving up to 32 gigs of memory from 24. Maximum power consumption increases from 450 watts on the 4090 to 575 watts on 5090, a 28% increase, while boost clocks actually drop. The 2.52 GHz average from 4090 drops to 2.41 GHz on 5090. This spec sheet suggests that Nvidia is pushing to get everything possible performance-wise from a 4nm design in a world where 4090 was already pushing limits. Now, with our new benchmarking workflow, we can visualize that for you based on actual game content and stack it up against prior Nvidia flagships, which will be the focus for many of our tests in this video. Here in Alan Wake 2, 5090 peaks in 530 watts territory, averaging at 517, 25% higher than 4090's 414 watts, while the 3090 Ti draws around 420 watts. There's a mere 240 watts from 2080 Ti, but it's only delivering 21% of 5090 performance, part of which may be down to lack of VRAM. In-the-moment testing also bears out the clock speed drop from 4090 to 5090, a delta of around 100 to 150 MHz. Power draw scales according to workload. Here in F124 on max settings, but with RT disabled, 5090 power draw drops to 434 watts on average, up against 490 at 348 watts. 3090 Ti at 424 watts and 2080 Ti at 258 watts. So there's definite performance scaling. 5090 is 3 times faster than 2080 Ti here. And it's also interesting to note the clock speed scaling across the successive generations in each of the tests here. As process node technologies improve, clocks get higher until we hit 5090. Effectively the same node as 4090, but a significantly larger chip has to run a touch slower. The performance increase gained from a wider design with more shaders, more power, and higher available bandwidth. Let's get into the numbers, but first of all, let's kick off by talking about AMD. The firm has made a conscious decision not to challenge Nvidia at the top end. And while there have been some promising benchmark leaks, we won't get empirical data on the new 9070 cards until March. Here's how things stack up right now, though, with 4K gaming. I'll keep this brief, as 4090 was always ahead in the most demanding workloads, and so it follows that 5090 will be faster still. Black Myth Wukong, a 77% performance uplift for the 5090 against 7900 XTX, with a 2x performance multiplier against the 7900 XT. Looking to the most powerful RDNA 2 card I have in my library, 5090 delivers a 2.x performance increase over the 6900 XT. This is on cinematic settings with no hardware RT features active, although of course Unreal Engine 5's software Lumen is a form of compute-based ray tracing. Hitman, with no ray tracing features active, has historically favoured AMD, so it's interesting to see the scores here. 5090 plays XTX with a 280 FPS average versus 180 FPS, a 53 percentage point boost for the 5090, rising to 70% with 7900 XT, and a 2.2x performance boost compared to 6900 XT. This benchmark is interesting because absolutely there will be workloads where the extreme price of the 5090 doesn't really make sense against cheaper cards. That said, pricing on Halo products rarely does. You want the best of the best, so you pay for it. The situation flips though with ray tracing, where the 5090 has a 146% performance boost over XTX, rising to a 2.8x performance multiplier over 7900 XT, increasing still further to an almost 4 times increase over 6900 XT. But again, there can be some variability in RT workloads too. Some games just run great on multiple architectures. So looking at Indiana Jones and the Great Circle here, a new addition to our benchmarking suite, increases are still of a generational nature, but they do close up. 5090 ahead of XTX by around 73% here, with the new flagship twice as fast as 7900 XT and almost 2.9x to the better against 6900 XT. Of course, this is apples to apples testing in a world where most Nvidia users are reaping the benefits of DLSS, and with so much take-up of that feature, there are genuine questions about the whole nature of apples to apples testing between vendors. That's a can of worms I think all reviewers, including us, are kicking down the road. And, well, that's one of the reasons why the lion's share of my testing looks at the latest Nvidia flagship up against its predecessors, all of which support DLSS that you can enable if you want. By starting at 2018's RTX 2080 Ti, through 3090 Ti, 4090 through to 5090, we get an interesting overview of trends, performance increases over the years. 2080 Ti caused waves by being a $1,000 product back in the day. 3090, $1,500, the Ti 2000. RTX 4090, 1,600 units of your US currency. The trend is clear. The more you want, the more you'll need to pay. And with RTX 5090, there's a broad equivalency between how much you pay and how many extra frames you get versus the 4090. Nvidia is looking to disrupt that with DLSS for multi-frame generation, of course, and that's a big topic we'll cover in this video, and I suspect many others. Standard benchmarks then for now, kicking off with ray tracing. Alan Wake 2 delivers a 35% performance increase for the 5090 against 4090, which is a 2.5x perf increase over 1390 Ti. No DLSS, no frame gen, so base numbers here are relatively low. A 47 frames per second average for the 5090. One thing to note with the 5090 though, there is some inconsistencies in frame times that has an impact on lowest 1% scores. Our automated benchmark run traverses the environment more quickly than actual gameplay, which does serve to emphasize this, but it is there. Against 5090, the 2080 Ti barely averages 10 frames per second. 5090 is 4.8 times faster, and maybe the 11 gigs of memory on the old card is an issue there. Avatar Frontiers of Pandora scales game assets and streams it in according to available VRAM, so the 2080 Ti is a bit more competitive here on native 4K Ultra settings. 5090, 23 points ahead of 4090, one of the lower score boosts we have, and again there's a 2x multiplier over 3090 Ti. At the rear there, 5090 increases performance by over 3.5 times compared to the 2080 Ti. Cyberpunk 2077 in Psycho RT mode here. We'll be looking at path tracing with DLSS 4 on a press build that Nvidia supplied in a bit. This is the existing retail version of the game. There's a 30% boost here for the 5090 over its predecessor, which is generally where we'd expect the new card to land based on its specs. Again, we're just over 2 times faster than 3090 Ti, while 2080 Ti languishes. 5090 is 4.6 times faster, and again there's a good chance the 11GB VRAM limit on the old card there has something to say about this result. Which brings us on to Indiana Jones and the Great Circle, which would not run our automated benchmark scene at all on the 2080 Ti, so we've actually had to make some allowances here, turning the texture pool setting down from supreme settings to high. Everything else is matched, all other cards are fully maxed. In an ideal world, Machine Games and its software would scale the pool in accordance with the available VRAM limits in the way Avatar does, but even so, high textures isn't really that much different from Supreme in actual play. So with that caveat in place, a 23.4% boost for 5090 over 4090 on the lower end of the spectrum, rising to 86% versus 3090 Ti, rising again to a 3.1x performance boost over 2080 Ti, which I should say can still run this game very well indeed with DLSS. Metro Exodus, an oldie but goodie in my view, the first AAA game built for hardware-accelerated ray tracing in the form of global illumination. A 26% lead for the 5090 here up against 4090, a 2.1x frame rate boost versus 3090 Ti, which lifts again to about 3.5 times when looking at 2018's flagship 2080 Ti. So at this point, with ray tracing, a pattern is forming. 5090 is essentially between 22 to 30% faster than 4090 despite the prodigious spec boosts across the board. Let's move on now to F124, where the Codemaster's Ego engine has been progressively enhanced over the years with more and more ray tracing features. We've moved to Bahrain in the rain here for GPU testing, but we'll be keeping our daylight Monaco run for CPU reviews. The 5090 outperforms 4090 by 30% here, which increases significantly to a 2x performance upgrade against 3090 Ti. An observation that we'll continue to hear a lot during this review. 2080 Ti does struggle though, again, perhaps owing to VRAM limits. But regardless, 5090 has a 3.8 times performance increase. But there are some outliers that move out of that window of performance improvements we've seen so far. So looking at a Plague Tale Requiem with its RT shadows enabled, 5090 has a 35% boost to frame rate over 4090. This opening scene here for the second chapter really seems to hammer bandwidth, which is one of the big spec boosts the new card has over the old. Beyond that, we're looking at a 2.3 times performance boost over 3090 Ti, rising to a 4x multiplier over 2080 Ti. Moving on to pure rasterization numbers and sticking with the Plague Tale Requiem, the performance increase moving from 4090 to 5090 actually increases compared to the ray tracing score. We've got a 38 percentage point boost here, and a 2.28 times multiplier over 3090 Ti. 2080 Ti, the old Turing card, is still struggling here, again possibly due to VRAM limits of 4K. 5090 has a 3.8x frame rate improvement. Okay, so moving on, we have numbers on Eurogamer for other rasterized variants of games already covered here. So I'm only going to cover the games I benched where RT isn't active, and that starts with Black Myth Wukong. Well, this is software ray tracing, but even so, a 24.6% performance improvement for 5090 over 4090, pretty much a straight doubling of frame rate over 3090 Ti, again, and a 3.3x performance boost over 2080 Ti. We're using the prologue chapter of the game here for testing, as we found it to be considerably more demanding on graphics resources up against the specific canned benchmark within the game. In a similar vein, we've added Senua's Saga Hellblade 2 to the benchmarking mix. Again, Unreal Engine 5. Again, no specific requirement for a DX12 Ultimate card with RT hardware, but similar to Wukong, there is still ray tracing, just the software variant of Epic's Lumen technology. A nigh on 29 percentage point boost for 5090 over 4090, a 91% uplift over 3090 Ti, and a 3.5x multiplier to FPS over 2080 Ti. Forza Horizon 5 here on extreme settings with 8x MSAA, and we're in familiar territory. 28% increase to performance moving from 4090 to 5090, rising to 92% for the new flagship compared to 3090 Ti. And an almost 3x frame rate boost up against a 2080 Ti. This one's also interesting in that neither 4090 nor 5090 are anywhere near their power limits here. There's a 362 watt average power draw from the new card, some way off its 575 watt maximum. And 4090 is averaging at just 283 watts, pretty close to 2080 Ti's 253 watts. So all told then, actual performance in the terms established can be viewed in one of two ways. There's no gigantic increase in frame rate going from 4090 to 5090 in the same way there was moving from 3090 Ti to 4090, where we could see anything from a 60 to 80 odd percentage point boost to frame rate. Judged by the numbers alone, you can almost view the 5090 as a kind of Titan-like GPU that would slot in above the 4090. A circa 25 to 30% boost is pretty much in line with the kind of delineation typically seen between products in the same lineup. Okay, so I would consider the idea of using the 5090 with a 1440p or 1080p screen kind of absurd, to be honest, but it would be remiss of me not to point out that all of the performance deltas we've talked about so far actually tighten up at lower resolutions. Nothing new here really, but worth pointing out when there's so much variance in the top-end resolution increases anyway. At the same time, the RTX 5090 is unquestionably the new GPU king, and this kind of hardware is just going to fly off the shelves anyway, if we're being honest. The 4090 sold as a Halo product because it was the best of the best, not because of metrics like frames per dollar or whatever. 5090 will do the same, while DLSS 4 support will give you stratospheric improvements to frame rate. Question is whether you consider it a core part of quote-unquote performance or a value-added extra. And this is a difficult one to answer because I do think there's a case that DLSS Super Resolution has migrated from a nice-to-have feature into an essential one. A lot of games are built with dynamic resolution or upscaling in mind, and you might not like it, but it is what it is. And Epic literally built their own upscaler to enable UE5 technologies like Lumen and Nanite on current generation consoles and mainstream PC parts after all. Frame generation, there are excellent use case scenarios, and the tech is only going to improve, right? But let's be clear, there are drawbacks with frame generation that you don't typically get with super resolution. Latency and more obvious artifacting, for example. There are also more limited use case scenarios, so it's pretty awesome to see frame rates in the hundreds, right? But I'd consider a 4K 240Hz monitor a must for this class of hardware. But still, let's test some DLSS 4 and try to fill in some of the missing gaps from the first look we had earlier in the month. But do bear in mind that Alex has his own content coming along. Remember, I was using a 5080 there, not a 5090, so it's perhaps not surprising to see DLSS 4 produce better results on what is a much more powerful piece of hardware. So, per the teaser at the beginning of the video, you can see that our new benchmarking tools allow us to pull in any data from frame view captures and map it onto content. There are three crucial elements to DLSS 4 we need to discuss: frame rate, frame time, and latency. Frame rate is the output that goes to your screen, and with multi-frame gen we get some tremendous boosts to the fluidity of the game. This particular Cyberpunk segment averages out at 286 frames per second. Bearing in mind we're talking about RT overdrive path tracing, that's almost absurd. Next up, frame time. This is all about smoothness, consistency. So check out the green line there. That's representing the super resolution frame time as a reference of sorts. The lines above it represent 2x, 3x and 4x frame gen, and they should be just as smooth, if not smoother. If they aren't, well, there are issues with pacing, I'd say. This Cyberpunk clip actually looks okay in that respect. Finally, we have latency, the big bone of contention. Is a game truly more performant if input lag is actually higher with frame generation active? So we've looked at this clip before earlier in the video, but latency is very low to begin with. And I personally find it difficult to tell the input lag difference when the window is that tight. Furthermore, as you'll see across the clips, base latency changes anyway quite substantially according to game content. So this is a tricky one to unpick. I don't feel frame gen is a good match for esports in any scenario, but in a AAA game like this, I would take the increased fluidity over a hit to input lag that I can't really feel. Now, here's the thing. I benched a number of Cyberpunk scenarios. We have a fair few in our automated benchmark suite, including custom runs, CD Projekt Red's own streaming tests, one of which you just saw, and the official benchmark. In fact, here is that benchmark, 4K RT overdrive naturally. Transformer mode super resolution, then multi-frame generation variants. With no DLSS at all, there's an average 33 frames per second here, and by the time DLSS is done, there's essentially an 8.5 times increase to frame rate. Let's switch over the native stat there to DLSS Super Resolution. Base frame rate is now 92 FPS average, gradually increasing with multi-frame gen to 283 frames per second average. Super Res is where input lag is at its lowest with an average 26.1 milliseconds. And its highest, as you would imagine at 4x MFG, sits at 35 milliseconds. So again, a 9 millisecond hit to input lag in exchange for a 3x improvement to frame rate. The game doesn't feel any better to play, but it certainly looks better to my eyes. We've got a couple of scenarios here that aim to more accurately map against actual gameplay. And let's start with this combat race mission. Base frame rate with native resolution path tracing is a low 31.7 frames per second. PS5 quality mode territory, but with full path tracing and no upscaling. Think about that. Latency averages out at 62.3 milliseconds. But obviously frame rates are higher with multi-frame gen and frame times are very, very short, grouping at the top there. Let's swap out native resolution stats in favor of super resolution. Latency is now at 30.5 milliseconds, rising to 39.9 with 4x MFG, so 9.4 milliseconds of lag in exchange for a 3.15 times boost to frame rate. The game feels very similar to play, but looks a lot smoother. So I guess I would call that a quasi-performance boost. Looks better, but doesn't feel better. This automated benchmark aims to replicate a fast run through the Cherry Blossom marketplace, a renowned challenge for both CPU and GPU in Cyberpunk 2077. Even with 4K path tracing on a 9800X3D, we may well be CPU limited here, at least partly. Native resolution sets the baseline, just 26.4 frames per second, and the highest input lag so far at 79.5 milliseconds. We are fully GPU bound here, clearly. Once DLSS 4 is fully enabled, frame rate is 232.6 frames per second average, an 8.8 times improvement over native, with a 50.31 millisecond average latency. Swapping from native stats to super res, base frame rate is now at 70.83 frames per second with a 40.1 millisecond latency average. You can see how frame rate increases as multi-frame gen kicks in, ultimately giving a 3.3x frame rate increase over super resolution stats. Lag increases, but not that much compared to prior results. The impact is a 10 millisecond hit to latency. Something else you may note is that the frame time graph is looking pretty spiky there compared to prior tests, even on the green super resolution line. Yeah, this does kind of suggest that there may be a CPU limit here. It's also spiky on the MFG readings too, so with Cyberpunk 2077 I think we have some optimal results here for DLSS 4. Once super resolution is factored in, frame rates are in a 70 to 90 frames per second window, which clearly delivers decent input lag, anything from 25 to 40 milliseconds. Frame gen seems to be a fixed cost, so the range there is basically 35 to 50 milliseconds. Now, I would consider this a regression in one particular area of what I would call performance, but as a trade, in terms of the actual experience, I think it's fine. However, the expectation is that faster frame rates means crisper controls. It's what you kind of want from extra performance, and you can't ignore the fact that you don't get this with DLSS 4. So, frame generation, still a work in progress. It can be transformative, but the quality of execution can vary, and perhaps that is another crucial point when talking about performance as a concept. Typically, a performance boost from newer, more capable hardware has no negatives. Things just run faster with no ill effects. Even if we factor out latency from the concept of performance, DLSS 4 still has something to prove, as implementations will vary in their success level from game to game, and so will the latency impact. But look, this is just the start of the conversation, and as I said, Alex will be following up with more DLSS 4 coverage soon. Now, let's sum up then, and it's all pretty basic stuff really. I took a look at all of the percentage gains on the RTX 5090 versus 4090. 17 results covering a range of games, many of which were tested with both rasterization and ray tracing, all at maximum settings. Averaging the gains, I got around a 31% uplift for the new 5090 flagship up against the old. Yeah, that's nowhere near as much of a leap as the 4090 was a couple of years ago, but then again, Nvidia hasn't used a new process node for the 5090, so the uplift was always going to be more limited. There isn't quite the sense of a bottomless pit of pure performance that 1490 delivered when we first went hands-on with it, but it's undeniably a good chunk faster. And yes, DLSS 4 does have merit, and is particularly beneficial for those with 4K high refresh rate screens, 165Hz and higher. And looking at the Founders Edition card, Nvidia has crafted something that genuinely elevates standards. You're paying a fortune for this Halo product, but you do feel you're getting something very, very special for your couple of $1,000s. So who's this card for then? Well, you'll be getting around twice the performance of the RTX 3090, 3090 Ti, both of which were hardly cheap back in the day. It's a good upgrade option. RTX 4090 owners recommending an upgrade here is more tricky. I'd start by working out the cost of ownership. How long have you owned the card? How much can you sell it for? The thing about high prices and low availability is that even last-gen cards are now holding their value more than they have previously. Raw price versus performance numbers though? Well, the 5080 will do better as it's half the price, and I don't expect it will have half the performance. But we'll be taking a look at that in more depth soon. But that's it from me for now. Like, subscribe, share if you enjoyed the content, and ring bells that result in allegedly instant notifications for you and a potential YouTube algorithm boost for us. More seriously, please do consider the DF supporter program. Put simply, it's what made our considerable investment in PC tooling possible, amongst a bunch of other stuff, and you'll get early access to DF Direct Weekly, Other early access opportunities, updates from the team every week, access to our amazing community, and of course, high-quality video downloads of everything we do. But for now at least, thanks for watching and supporting Digital Foundry.